people, how are you all? Happy Pride 2022! Whoa! Those of you who've been here for a while might remember that in previous years I've done little series of Speedpaint with a set of characters that I designed specifically for Pride. One for each major label or identity that I was aware of at the time I was doing them. But if I've learned anything from the little amazing burst of queer media that's come out in the last couple of months, as well as some of the shows that I've rediscovered, it's that one of my favourite things is when a character is more than just their identity, and that the worst characters are those who entire life and story seems to revolve around this one facet of their personality, and they aren't really people beyond that. So this year I decided to finally do an in-depth talk about my comic, properly introducing all the main very queer characters and talking about their identities. And their identities as queer people and their identities separate from that. Instead of just rehashing the same, 6 or 7 characters who, let's face it, I did make specifically for those queer identities and they don't have much more substance to them. That's not to say that I don't have plans to redraw them in the future. I am quite proud of some of the designs, and some of them, such as Livy, really have started to take on their own life as individual people. But this felt like the better thing to do right now, and felt more like what I wanted to be doing. So let's start at the beginning, shall we? My first character is Dandan, who I have definitely mentioned on here before. And he's the main character. This is his story, so to speak. He's based on the character of the same name from Arthurian legend and the Round Table stories, and if you've never heard of him, I'm honestly not that surprised. He's a pretty minor character who somehow just keeps popping up all over the place, and so I figured why not tell his story for a change and come up with some explanations for why he is everywhere and how he connects all these different people together. My Dandan is laid back, slightly cynical, but he does try to be a good person to the best of his ability, but he's also decidedly not the kind of reckless or stupid brave sort of hero that pops up in other stories. If something seems like it's going to get him killed, then it probably is, and he would much rather keep out of it, thank you very much. The story follows him and a couple of his friends as he tries to navigate the very narrow strip between what he thinks is the right thing to be doing and the sensible thing to be doing, and what is expected of him by the society he lives in. As well as just general run-ins with the absurdity that is chivalry and courtly love, which expects you to start dueling everyone over the tiniest perceived slight, and that to be in love with a married woman is far more romantic than to be in love with a single one or anyone you might have out shot with. And Dandan's skepticism of courtly love is a definite carryover from the original legends, in which he is mostly known for mocking the concept and for being one of the few knights who actively chooses not to take any lady love, and that's something he readily admits to. As such, I obviously decided to write him as very gay. Aromantic might have been a more accurate interpretation in hindsight, as he does seem thoroughly disinterested in the concept as a whole, but I'm a little bit of a romantic sap, and I just wanted to write a love story, so I decided this worked as well for the main character, and it's fine. Dandan, my version at least, is approximately 6'2", very tall, pretty lanky. His birthday is on the 16th of March, although in a very non-specific year because my story is set in kind of a parallel history to our own history, because obviously we have no proofs as to whether King Arthur existed, and it's not a specific time period. He's 26 years old, though, and is the middle child of 3, so has both an older and a younger brother. His emblem is just a little striped shield, because I thought it was important that he really does just come across as generic as humanly possible in terms of his status and his relevance to all the major things that seem to be going on. He's not anything special. He's no chosen one or a lost prince. He's just a normal guy who is always in the wrong place at the wrong time and gets caught up in all sorts of nonsense because of it. In line with the mythology, though, He is catastrophically terrible with a sword. He avoids duels wherever he can, both because he's likely to lose, and because he thinks that dueling to the death for the sake of it is a rather silly concept to begin with, and quite frankly I agree. That said, he's not as terrible at jousting, and is very fond of spending time with his horse, which is probably one of the reasons why he's an acceptable jouster, because he's a pretty good rider. He also loves books and reading, because I'm incapable of writing a protagonist who is not also a bookworm, and I just figured, if you can't be athletic, you might as well be smart. He became a knight kind of because it was expected of him. He's a second son, so he has nothing to inherit, and his older brother Daniel joined the Round Table and, did a few years of knighthood before he got married and settled down, and convinced Dandan that if nothing else it was a chance to get out, go see the world, what's the worst that can happen? He's a knight with the Round Table, which, whilst he disdains chivalry as a general concept, he does have a fair amount of respect for King Arthur and the general mission of the table, help the helpless and defend those who can't defend themselves, that kind of vibe. He gets it, and he does respect Arthur. He goes out on the quests which Arthur sends him on, spends time with his friends, and tries not to dwell too much on the fact that he has no idea what he wants to do with his future. So that brings us on to Dandan's friends, and our next character, Governale, or Gov for short, because quite frankly, his full name is a mouthful. Also based on a real character from Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur, and he's a squire to one of the later characters I'm going to talk about. In fact, I think every single character, bar possibly Daniel's wife and son, are interpretations of some character that appears in the original. But Gov is admittedly a very, very minor one in the original, so I gave myself a lot of free rein when designing him and working out who I wanted him to be. Gov is also very chill, but whereas Dandan is chill in a not my division kind of way, Gov is more chill in the way that nothing really phases him. He's easily the most competent character in the entire story, both emotionally and physically, and is almost a textbook example of the mum friend, in that he's insanely practical about things, always prepared for every eventuality, especially those that involve his companions doing something monumentally stupid. He's also fiercely loyal and a really big softie. He will walk through hell for those he cares about, and he'll remember to actually bring the burn gel with him for when they all inevitably get turned to crisps. I'd also like to say he's got quite a dry sense of humour, but that is really going to depend on whether when I'm writing this I can actually work out how to be funny myself. Gov is 6'4", which sounds obscenely tall, but it's actually how tall my little brother is, and is a height I specifically picked to make him seem more initially intimidating, despite how sweet he actually is. He's meant to look like a bit of a contradiction. His birthday is the 1st of July, and he's 25 years old, although the first chapter of the story I think I'm probably going to set in June, so he won't be 25 for very long, I guess. He has no biological family to speak of, but was essentially adopted by one of my other characters when they were kids, and considers his friends to be his family. He's also the first of the asexual characters I've made, although I can't really remember my reasoning for making him asexual. I think it's because at the time I was trying to pin down what his character was going to be. I was also starting to learn about what being ace actually meant and realising that, oh hey, this all sounds terrifyingly relatable. And ended up projecting onto him just a little bit. But I do also just really like the idea of having an ace character who is the most nurturing and caring person imaginable, instead of some of the interpretations I've seen on television in which the ace character is a literal block of ice with a human face. As I said, Gov is the most competent character. He's physically the strongest and is good with using pretty much any kind of weapon you could throw at him, although his favourites are a massive two-handed sword and his hunting bow. He's excellent to have around in any kind of big brawl sort of situation, but is probably slightly less good one-on-one just because he doesn't have the skill and the training that a lot of the knights have. He's still much better than Dandan though, so there's that. He's a squire pretty much by choice, as he's certainly skilled enough to become a knight, and Arthur's Round Table knights people based on their good deeds rather than when they come from a prestigious family. The concept is basically anyone can become a knight if they've got the skills they need. But honestly, Gov likes keeping a low profile, which is much easier to do as a squire, and also adds kind of the edge that most people tend to underestimate him a little, which is always an advantage. He met Dandan through a mutual friend, but the two of them get along pretty well given their shared opinions on some of the more absurd chivalric rules, and they have a lot of fun laughing at their other friends' shenanigans together. Unfortunately, that's kind of the extent of that friendship, as they don't really have that much in common in terms of general interests, given that Dandan loves stories and reading and nature and the idea of adventure, but probably not the practicalities of it. And Gov would happily spend all day looking at different kinds of swords and axes and watching and critiquing other knights fight each other. So the two tend to run out of things to talk about when they're left alone together. That said, they do genuinely care about each other and will help one another at the drop of a hat. The next character, however, does have more similarities to Gov, in that she's kind of his mirror from a world where he wasn't adopted and looked after by his best friend. Her name is Bran, or Branjin, based off the character of the same name, or more commonly the character known as Bragwain from the prose Tristan. She was also the first character after Dandan that I properly designed and built up into an actual person. I obviously knew that some of the others would need to exist, but I worked on her first, and I think her physical design is probably the one least changed from my first attempt nearly 2 years ago now. Bran is an approximation of the short but feisty stereotype. She's very stubborn and has enough determination to do just about anything she sets her mind to, but as a result doesn't take particularly well to people trying to help her because she tends to interpret it as a slight to her own abilities. She is admittedly based on certain fragments of my own personality, so there's certainly a number of layers to her, some of which I don't know if will come through when I finally write her, but I feel personally I have a good idea of who she is as a real being. She is instinctively not overly trusting of people, because if she can't work out why they're helping her, then it's probably for a bad reason as far as she's concerned. But she does still deeply care about people that she is attached to. Bran is 5'3", and the shortest character in the whole story, with the exception of actual children. Partly just so that Gov can tease her about being short the way that my brother teases me. I'm not short, I'm average height, but we'll get into that later. And her birthday is the 25th of April. She's 23 years old, which makes her the youngest character in the story, with a few minor exceptions such as Dandan's nephew and his younger brother. And I think that probably comes across in her character, as she really doesn't know where she belongs in the world most of the time. Even Dandan knows where he fits, even if he hasn't quite worked out whether that's where he wants to be. But Bran really has no idea of who she is. She hasn't worked it all out yet. She starts her story as a lady-in-waiting for a princess. She grew up in service to that family, and while she was quite close with the princess as kids, they've definitely grown apart over the years as they've become two very different people. Because she spends so much time having to bite her tongue around said family, even when they're making rather callous and hurtful comments about various people or just generally being quite snarky, Bran tends to lash out at those she is allowed to talk back to, and has kind of ended up with no friends as a consequence. It's why when she finally does meet Dandan and Gov, she gets really lucky, because neither of them seem to take her grumpiness or her rudeness that personally, because they're both very chill people, and instead just kind of bundle her up like she's an angry cat, and help her anyway, despite the fact that she keeps trying to scratch them. She even eventually learns to trust Gov enough to let him actually help her and teach her how to fight and defend herself properly. Bran doesn't currently have any romantic subplots in the works, which is something that keeps kind of fluctuating. I keep thinking about it, bringing it back, probably because my own ability to imagine myself in a relationship is all over the place at the minute. but I do certainly have a few ideas of scenes where she does experience a crush or two and gets very defensive about it, which I think could be kind of amusing and possibly adorable if I write it the correct way. She is, of course, based on the background of her portrait, which I hope you guys have noticed the backgrounds are related to the flags, bisexual, which is once again probably just because at the time I was writing her, I also believed myself to be bisexual and allo instead of ace. And in conclusion, I probably just ought to stop projecting onto my own characters like an idiot, and we might get somewhere with this. You definitely have heard, though, of my next character, and that is Sir Lancelot. Probably the most famous of Arthur's knights ever, particularly well known for his part in the very destructive love triangle between Arthur, Sir Lancelot and Queen Guinevere, the kind of poster boy for courtly love, which every person to ever write any kind of adaptation of the Round Table has to work out how they want to deal with, and how, if at all, they plan to make all three characters likeable human beings rather than turning one of the guys into the villain or making Guinevere basically just a sexy object to be fawned over rather than a real person with agency. I think the best I've ever seen it done is the Mechanism's take on it, which just said, well, let's make it polyamorous, which, quite frankly, was ingenious and unfortunately was never going to work for my story because the thing about Lancelot is he is also the main romantic interest for Dandan in my story. He's definitely become a more layered character over the development of the story and as I worked out the other characters. Probably has the most detailed backstory of the lot because of it. Unlike Dandan, he very much does conform to society's expectations of him, almost to an absurd degree. He's a perfectionist and appears very outgoing and sociable and polite on the surface, as well as kind of ignorant sometimes as to where all of these rules and manners came from and why he chooses to follow them. However, he's also just deeply confused by a lot of what's going on around him because he doesn't quite understand why the world looks the way it does, despite trying desperately to fit into it. Lancelot is the chosen one, the prophecy child, and I suppose not quite the lost prince, so much as the purposefully misplaced prince who they put somewhere else for safekeeping. He was raised fully knowing that it would one day be his destiny to either save or destroy Arthur's kingdom and to change the course of history. And growing up, he was taught how to fight because he was going to be Arthur's greatest knight, and the value of kindness and empathy, all things that his mum thought would probably be really helpful to him in achieving that goal. But when he did finally arrive at court, he was bombarded with information on what a true knight and what the best knight was supposed to look like, and all of these different rules and idiosyncrasies of society and socializing that he had never been introduced to before, and he kind of let all those ideas shape him into who he thought he was supposed to be. Lancelot, in my version, is approximately 6 foot tall and was born on the 29th of February because I thought it was kind of amusing how, like the prophecy, being born on a leap day makes you special technically, but it's so much less fun than it seems on the surface. He's 26 years old and has kind of a complicated family technically. His biological parents are the King and Queen of Benoic in France, and he also has 4 older brothers. However, he's only met any of them about once in his life, as he was actually raised, like I said, misplaced prince, by the Lady of the Lake, who is pretty much his only strong family connection, and as far as he's concerned, that's his mother. Lance is also a very skilled fighter and has absolutely flawless skill and technique in all of the knightly arts. So basically all the weapons that Gov doesn't use that often. And to be honest, the two of them, if they were ever put together, would make such a deadly pair fighting side by side, because you got brute force on one side, you got skill and technique on the other. It'd be really cool. His knowledge of the intricacies of chivalry and courtly behaviour could possibly also be considered a strength as well, as he's certainly not likely to accidentally offend any important lords, unlike Dandan might. But he's also probably not familiar enough with the meanings of those behaviours that he could use them to his own advantage. Lance is demisexual, partly because this was also an identity I was exploring for a while, and partly because I don't really know how to write a relationship that isn't at least slightly ace-coded. What's going on between him and Guinevere is something that I think I'm going to leave for the actual story though, because I quite like the angle I'm taking with that whole love triangle, and I wouldn't want to spoil it. As for Dandan, Lance is very much the outsider to the little group that is forming. Even Bran and her princess get tied into that group of friends pretty early on, whereas Lance is very much separate, an outsider, somebody that even the plot isn't forcing to be around Dandan. It just keeps kind of happening. They should hopefully appear to be foils of each other to an extent. Lancelot forcing Dandan to re-examine his skepticism and the way he automatically jumps to conclusions about people, particularly people who do seem very invested in this absurd way of life. Whereas Dandan forces Lance to think about who he really is and who he actually wants to be when you strip away all of the little bits of himself that he's carefully crafted to be perfect. Their relationship is the centre of the story and hopefully is going to be really cool and interesting to read. It's something that I'm definitely looking forward to writing. So next we have that princess I was talking about, Iseult. You may have possibly heard of her, also known as Isolde. She's a pretty keep up the pros Tristan, and it's of course the princess that Bran serves. Iseult's character has admittedly changed a bit since I originally thought of her. She's snarky, self-absorbed, and honestly quite savage when she wants to be, but after a while, and after I created her love interest, I realised I probably needed to play around with her character a little bit and make her actually likeable, or at least make her in such a way that you could conceive of why somebody else might like her, even if you yourself didn't. So now a lot of what makes her seem harsh comes from her trying to protect herself. It's a defence mechanism of sorts. She has been treated like an object to be sold off for a lot of her life, and as such she plays the game right back, treating most people she knows like pieces on a chessboard to be manipulated to try and make the best of a situation for her. She uses her influence and power and her family name and wields them like Gov wields a sword to get what she wants. I think her girlfriend is attracted to her precisely because she is so smart and intelligent, and that deep down she really does care about people who treat her like a human being as opposed to a shiny trinket. Iseult is 24 years old, and yes, I am completely passing on that whole medieval nobility get married off with kids thing, because this comic is by no means historically accurate. It is a parallel universe situation because of the whole, no date for King Arthur thing, and frankly it's very creepy, and I don't want to have to write a world in which a 14-year-old is expected to be married already. She's 5'6" and was born on the 22nd of November, and she's the daughter of King Angus, also called King Anguish in a number of different versions of the story, and his queen, who I can't actually decide whether I want to call her Elaine or possibly Isolde to call back to Iseult's other name. She does exist in the stories, it's just that a lot of the women in the King Arthur stories don't have names, and so trying to pick names for them is always a bit of fun. Iseult's main strengths are probably that she's an absolute political minefield. She will find a way to get what she wants, and she will happily step on and crush other people to do it. She can talk just about anyone into doing what she wants, all whilst making them think it was their idea the entire time. However, her prickly nature means she also really only has one person that she genuinely trusts, and so is very vulnerable if anyone can work out how to back her into a corner where she doesn't have many options or people to turn to. Needless to say, she doesn't exactly get on with any of the other main characters. Although her and Bran obviously have history, and the one remaining character I have to talk about certainly respects her attitude to the world, even if the two of them don't actually like each other very much. They sort of understand each other. Her main goal is to find herself a husband who likes her enough to let her manage her own spending, support her lifestyle, let her buy lots of fabulous dresses and go on constant trips to visit people she actually does like, but a husband who doesn't like her so much that he sticks his nose in where it isn't wanted or actually pays her too much attention. Her girlfriend 100% backs her up in this goal, but is kind of trying to convince her to marry someone that she actually likes, and maybe might even love eventually, because she wants Isolde to be happy and doesn't really mind sharing, and knows that if Isolde could just learn to let some more people in, she might actually, not be miserable all the time. It's also worth mentioning that Isolde is a lot of fun to draw because I get to give her a new dress in every scene if I feel like it, and just because of that I really like her as a character. And finally we have Sir Tristan, also known as Tristram and other variations of that same name. He's fairly well known, or at least a name that people tend to recognise, I think, and he's in particular known for being an excellent knight, comparable with Lancelot, and for being good friends with Sir Dandan. In some versions his squire is given an actual name too, and that name is obviously Gouvernail. So he is kind of the final piece in this puzzle for now. He is the friend that Dandan and Gouvernail met through. He is the guy who accidentally gets them all involved with Isolde and Bran. He's the connecting piece. My Tristan is confident, outgoing, and will flirt with basically anything that moves. It's just kind of how he communicates. Although one of the reasons why he's last on this list is because it's Pride Month, and he's kind of the token straight guy of my comic. And by that I mean he's literally the only character I've decided 100% is probably straight. And I say probably because, like I said, he does flirt with everyone, and probably has or would try out dating guys if he ever felt like it, but as a general rule he's into women. It happens sometimes. Sometimes, no matter how hard we try, we gotta write a straight character. He's also got a rather healthy disrespect for authority, and whilst Dandan openly disapproves of a lot of the rules of chivalry and romance and how they work, Tristan tends to actively use them to his advantage despite also agreeing they're rubbish. It's one of the reasons why he respects Isolde even if he doesn't like her, because he completely understands the concept of playing the system if the system won't help you. Tristan is 5'11"-ish and 27 years old, born on the 15th of September. His family history is a touch messy, as his stepmother accidentally murdered his stepbrother whilst trying to kill him, and then his dad got him shipped off to boarding school in France to protect him. But luckily for him, that's where he met Gov, who he basically adopted as a younger brother, and they are best friends. When he finally returned home, his father had died, and he had managed to patch things up with his stepmom before he decided he'd go off and try be a knight. So he visited his uncle, King Mark, who not only refused to knight him, but basically refused to acknowledge his existence too. As a result, Tristan quests up and down the country as if he were a knight, often with Dandan and Gov to accompany him, but refuses to let anybody else knight him until Mark finally recognises that he exists, because, it's his nephew, his only nephew, and he could take an interest. He's a pretty great knight too, despite not actually being one. He doesn't have quite the flawless technique that Lancelot possesses, but he's very good at bending the rules and being unpredictable, while still not doing anything that would be considered unknightly, which makes him rather difficult to fight for a lot of people. He's also exceedingly loyal to those he actually does care about. Dandan and Gov are his family, as far as he's concerned, and he will absolutely always look out for them, and by extension, Dandan's brother and their family too. I like to imagine that ultimately he does end up on good terms with his stepmom, that whilst they don't exactly get along, he would protect her as well if needed, although I'm not sure if that will ever come up in the story as a whole. In terms of his love life, it's kind of sad. The one woman he actually does love is a lesbian and will never want him, and he's very respectful of that. I know I'm writing him as kind of a flirtatious playboy sort of character, but he does have a genuine respect for people as human beings, and whilst he flirts with everyone, he by no means feels entitled to anyone returning that, which I hope is going to make him come across as less annoying than he might otherwise seem. He's generally quite a nice person. He's just got his friends, and that's happy, and that's enough for him, and he doesn't expect anything more, really. So that is everyone. I had originally planned to do a part 2 to this with 5 or 6 queer side characters that I'm really excited about and probably won't get a chance to write about for a long time because they don't appear till later in the comic. But this took a lot longer than I expected it to, so I'm not entirely sure I have the time for that, particularly as it would be slowing down the process of my actual comic, which would suck, especially as I'm actually getting somewhere with it and have decided that at the end of this summer I am just going to post all the chapters that I have finished, regardless of how many there are, just because if I start getting it out there, I think I'll really be able to keep up momentum, hopefully. But if you guys do want to hear more about my little creations, then I'm more than happy to make that part 2. If not, however, then I suspect my next video will finally be my foundation vid on my FMP, which I am kind of excited about now. I had my first ever art show just a couple days ago, and it was really great, and I kind of want to talk about it. But until then, thanks so much for watching, particularly if you made it this far. I know that I end up rambling sometimes, particularly when I'm talking about things I've made. But thank you for bearing with me, and I'll see you all soon. Bye!